I have to say, just personally, as an anti-war activist, I care about war everywhere. And my government has been bombing countless countries, brutalizing populations, subjugating tens of millions of people across the planet for decades. I think that this is a criminal act, what Putin has done, and I do have moral problems with it. I think war is horrific, and civilians needlessly die and suffer every time war is carried out. It kills soldiers on both sides that don't have to die. It just breeds hostility and resentment between two countries that have these historic roots and ties. I think war can only be accepted as an absolute last resort. And I'm not afraid to say that while I understand the central role of the US in creating this tinderbox, I still condemn any illegal invasion of another country. And I think as leftists, we shouldn't be afraid to say, this is wrong. This is a violation of international law, that a standard of law needs to be applied equally to every country in the world. And I think that's consistent with progressive values, to be repelled by bombs and troops entering a country when it absolutely did not have to happen. And while I fully recognize and understand Russia's security concerns, I am afraid that this is going to escalate tensions, that this action could lead to a potentially catastrophic conflict. And, there's this weird tendency, and I think maybe it has to do with just this glorification of war, the culture that militarism is baked into American society. And especially as anti imperialists, I think that justifiably so. I reflexively tend to defend countries that are under attack from the US empire. But I think it's important to not reflexively take the PR of a huge capitalist country. I mean, basically using this line of denazification, right? I think it is very clear to me, at least, that this is not necessarily about denazifying Ukraine. It's about Russia stepping in and saying, we're not going to fucking take this anymore. We are going to assert ourselves on the world stage. And it's okay to have criticisms of that, attitude and policy, and to just not kind of blindly have this celebratory stance that this is all good and we need to we need to just reflexively defend what Russia is doing. I feel like there has to be a nuanced discussion where we give oxygen to many facets on the left, and this includes people in the communist parties in Russia. It includes leftists who I'm sure are protesting the invasion in the streets right now. And I want to get into that too, Brian, but I also want to get into what Putin's speech actually detailed. His speech announced this military operation, and it was very surreal because it's very hard to find the transcript in Western media. Of course, they just pick out the facets that are the most bellicose and belligerent, talking about how we're nuclear armed power and we're going to retaliate with our full nuclear arsenal if anyone tries to impede what we're doing. Of course, those are picked up and put on the front pages. But what you don't see are all of the excerpts about NATO that legitimize everything that you're saying and what Putin has used to justify this. And it also really omits this entire bizarre anti-communist underpinning of what he's doing. So can you speak to this virulent focus on anti-communism? I mean, he talks about the Soviet policy of self-determination, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and the Russian Empire under the Tsar. I guess just walk us through this speech, and also, the division and the space that we need to understand the difference of opinions on the left, in this instance.
Yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to address all of these issues, in fact, including what the orientation should be of the U.S. anti-war movement, or for myself, Marxist and socialist movement. Um, I want to be able to have enough time to be able to address that, um, because I feel that uh, the while this is a terrible war, because as you said, there's so much death and destruction that happens in any war, and also the fact that Russians are invading Ukraine and Russians are killing Ukrainians and Ukrainians killing Russians when they were one people. They were the Soviet people working together against fascism, uh, up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, it can't be more tragic and more distressing. And I think to lightheartedly become a cheerleader uh, or think that this is just a wonderful event is sort of a it's a disgrace, actually, in terms of a correct understanding of the history. I do believe that the United States is responsible for the crisis, and I do believe the United States presented to Putin and to the Russian establishment a set of options that the Russians had made clear were unacceptable, and that under no circumstances were they going to allow Ukraine to be a staging ground for advanced nuclear missiles against Russia. So, Russia, I think for the past few months, has been saying, let's negotiate. These are our red lines. We're really serious. We're amassing 150,000 troops to show you how serious we are. And in each and every instance, the US said no to that, where it would have been so easy to say yes. What would have been wrong with Ukraine having been a neutral country? So I want to just say I really fully, while I don't support Russia's invasion into Ukraine, I do want to emphasize, especially for Americans, how the United States government, the government that speaks in our name, is fully responsible for this getting to this point. It didn't need to be this place, which doesn't mean Putin and the Russian government don't have responsibility as well. And I want to come back and talk about that. But to your question about Putin's speech, it was an extremely revealing speech. He made it February 21st. He's made 3 speeches, I believe, this week now. February 21st, which is the day before the coup, 8 years to the day before the coup that changes everything in Ukraine. And he gives basically a historic explanation for why it's sort of a grievance. It's a long grievance about Russia's relationship with Ukraine. And he basically blames Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks for the current crisis and for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is phenomenal, given the fact that the man who appointed Putin to be his successor, Boris Yeltsin, who was a capitalist counter-revolutionary, was in fact the person who literally dissolved the Soviet Union on December 16th, 1991, when he signed a decree illegally and arbitrarily ending the union. He was the president of Russia at that time. So Putin doesn't condemn Boris Yeltsin, the capitalist counter-revolutionary. Instead, he condemns Lenin. So and Lenin's sin, according to Putin, is twofold. One, that Ukraine was created as a separate republic by the Treaty of 1922 that forms the Soviet Union in 1924 in the Constitution. So there's a treaty signed between a few republics. There's 4 at the time: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. They formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And in that constitution that ratifies that in 1924, it's also stipulated that each of the republics has the right to secede, meaning the right to be self-determining, the right of self-determination, the right to leave the Union if they feel the Union is not, doing what it needs to do for the people of that republic. So Lenin insisted on this right of self-determination because he said, our problem in building socialism in the territories of the former Russian Empire is great Russian chauvinism, meaning that Russia, which was the prison house of oppressed minorities and minority peoples and ethnicities and nationalities, cultivated the equivalent of kind of a white supremacy against the other non-Russian peoples. And Lenin said to build solidarity between Ukrainian and Georgian workers, or the workers of the Baltics, or the workers of any of the former Soviet Russian Empire, we have to show we're past that. We're past that. And as a matter of fact, not only are we past it, but your connection or federation or union with us Russians, will be based on your right to divorce, your right to say the marriage isn't working. The right of self-determination, the right of secession is for republics what the right of divorce is for couples. It means at a certain point, if you feel the relationship isn't working, you can leave. If all the power is one side of the relationship and there's no power, no ability for the other side to leave, then it's not a real marriage, it's a subjugation. And Lenin said the only way to build international solidarity between the various working classes of different ethnicities and nationalities is to guarantee the right of self-determination. And Putin demagogically says this is, if you want to call Ukraine anything, you could call it Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He said because by creating Ukraine and allowing it to be independent from Russia, that meant that they sowed the seeds for the later dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he said basically this is a theft by the Bolsheviks of Russian land from Russia. So that's important because when we heard that speech on February 21st, we in the PSL and in the left, we were like, what the hell? We've never fully heard Putin develop his anti-Leninist positions so fully. But obviously, Putin says Lenin made a mistake at Brest-Litovsk, meaning when they signed the treaty, this is part of his speech, he said, he gave away Ukraine to Germany. He gave Ukraine to Germany, the treaty that was signed in March 1918 between the Russian Revolutionary Government and the German Empire in 1918 at Brest-Litovsk, allowed Germany to basically annex Ukraine. But Lenin's position at that time was, we had a revolution. We no longer have an army. We're being invaded by 14 imperialist armies. We can't fight a war against Germany, so we'll sign a treaty. It's a humiliating treaty, but we don't have any option. We can't do it. And so Putin demagogically denounces Lenin for having signed the treaty, which was absolutely necessary for the Russians to do. He also denounces Lenin for having the position of revolutionary defeatism. It's clear that revolutionary defeatism meant that the Bolsheviks took the position, we prefer the defeat of our own czarist government or bourgeois government in an international imperialist war than its victory, because our real enemy is at home. Our real enemy are the capitalists here. They're not in Germany or France or Britain or the United States. We're fighting the class struggle here. And he also recommended that the German comrades and the French comrades and the British comrades and the American comrades take the same position. Everybody take the position of not defending their own imperialist bourgeoisie in the war. So Putin denounces Lenin for revolutionary defeatism. He says that's unpatriotic. It gave away Russian land. He denounces him for Brest-Litovsk. He denounces him for creating Ukraine, and he denounces him for the right of self-determination. That can only be understood by anybody who's paying attention to history and politics, that Putin's appeal the day before he's about to invade Ukraine is not to the left. It's not to the workers and to the peasants of Ukraine. This is an appeal to the Russian right. And I think it's really important for the left, including the left that sees NATO as the aggressor, to not follow Putin, not to put Putin on a pedestal, not to follow this anti-communist core sort of Russian chauvinist orientation towards non-Russian peoples. I mean, he says other things that are not chauvinistic, but nonetheless, he was making this really unique historical argument for why Ukraine could be reincorporated into Russia as it had been under the Tsar. And then the invasion happens, and it's clear what's the purpose of the invasion. What is Putin actually trying to do? He's trying to make it, one, we have to be very clear about this. Putin is trying to make it clear to NATO, Ukraine will never be part of NATO. And that's obviously what he's saying. Two, he says he's going to denazify the country, meaning the fascists who are attacking the people in the East are going to be captured and they're going to be put on trial or they're going to be killed. That will be popular in Russia. That will be a very popular talking point in Russia. Unfortunately, some people in the West think that all of Ukraine is Nazified, which is not true. That's not what Ukraine is. That's not a correct, objective, accurate assessment. And the other thing is that he's signaling to the West, and this is very important, that the period of appeasement between Russia and the West that's existed since 1991, when they appeased them on Iraq, they appeased them on Libya, they stopped appeasing on Syria, but now the appeasement has ended. He said, basically, we wanted to have a negotiated settlement, but you said no. we're done with negotiating. We're now going to show you that Russia is a great power. And so that's why this has changed global politics, because it's the reemergence of Russia under a bourgeois leadership, demonstrating that it is a major world power and willing to use military force against NATO or NATO-inspired machinations. That's nothing like this has happened in world politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union.